Good evening and welcome to another edition of Your Pocket Mechanic. Tonight I'm going to do something a little bit different and talk about diesels, since I rarely talk about them in my videos, which is kind of odd because that's what I work on. And what brought this up is I'm regularly talking about additives that people may buy, like engine oil supplements or transmission oil supplements, and I speak out against them because I often think they're a waste of money. But I had a friend come up the other day and ask me about a coolant additive that he was recommended for his F-250 diesel. And he didn't know whether or not he was being sold something he didn't need, or if they were pushing him for a service that really was just kind of a waste of money, just something that would make them money but that his truck really didn't need. And I actually had to tell him, yes, your truck does need this. And what I'm talking about is what's called diesel coolant additive. And they're marketed by different companies. They're also marketed by the actual manufacturer of the vehicle. They look something like this. Now let me explain why these might be needed. A regular gasoline engine, their cooling system operates normally and doesn't usually get what's called, vacuum bubbles. Vacuum bubbles happen in diesel engines because they're built a little bit differently than a gasoline engine. A gasoline engine has a engine block with cylinders that the pistons go up and down in. They look something like this. Now, as you notice in the gasoline engine block, it's one solid piece with whole cylinders in it that the pistons go up and down in. Now, a diesel engine, on the other hand, still uses a block, but instead of having cylinders honed into the block, they use sleeves inserted in the block for the piston to go up and down in. That looks something like this. There's a significant difference in the way gasoline engines and diesel engines operate. Diesel engines use compression to ignite the fuel, whereas gasoline engines use a spark plug to light the fuel. This tremendous amount of compression pressure eventually starts creating bubbles inside the cooling system, and when these bubbles gather around metal components, they pop. I like to think of club soda as a good example. If you pour a glass of club soda, you can see the little bubbles in there. Now that's carbonation, but it kind of gives you an example of what the cooling system starts looking like in a diesel engine. And when these bubbles pop against the metal components inside a diesel, it creates what's called cavitation that looks something like this. Now, as you notice, this cavitation where it almost looks like somebody took a shotgun and fired it at these metal components. Well, after a while, this cavitation can end up eating a hole in these metal components. It happens usually slowly, and you don't know that it's happening. It's not something you can see unless you take the engine apart. But what happens is they'll eventually wear a hole into these metal components, and the first sign you usually start noticing is that you're losing coolant with no leak. It actually ends up going into the oiling system. You don't see a leak, you start losing coolant and don't know where it's going. Usually the first sign, though, is, of course, you pull out the dipstick level and your engine oil level is slowly going up. That's because it's filling with coolant. Now, these supplemental coolant additives, SCAs, or diesel coolant additives, DCA, whatever you want to call it, is added to the cooling system, kind of build a barrier in between these metal components and the bubbles. Now, I want to advise you, though, that it's not one of those things where if a little is good, a lot is better. That's not how it works. Nor does it do anything for the coolant's, boiling point or freezing point. That's the job of the engine coolant. Now, there's a recommended amount that is to be added to the cooling system, which is what my friend was asking me about. Now, there's places that sell test strips that you can measure the amount of the coolant additive that's in the cooling system. Don't buy a lot of these strips because they do have a very short shelf life. But they recommend that you test your cooling system about every other oil change to make sure it's well protected against cavitation. If there's any question, if you have any doubt about the condition of your cooling system and you have a lot of miles on the vehicle, I recommend flushing the cooling system. That means taking all of what's in there out, adding the correct amount of engine coolant. I also recommend adding the correct amount of distilled water, although regular water would work. Distilled water usually works a little bit better, and the recommended amount of the supplemental coolant additive. It's on the bottle, and it's usually, I'm going to say, around a pint for every 2 gallons. That'll give you a fresh start, and you're well protected at that point, but then you want to continue testing it about every other oil change. How long does it last? Well, it kind of depends on your driving habits. It depends on the condition of the water where you live or whatever water you added. As long as you keep testing it and it tests good, you're doing well. You're protected against cavitation. So there you have it. That's one additive I do recommend. In fact, I strongly encourage it, or you're going to be buying yourself an engine soon. I'm Randy Ruth. Thank you for watching Your Pocket Mechanic.